The Galactic Tribunal reconvened 3 days after the incident, and the Grand Chamber was filled with tension so thick that it seemed to have its own weight. The Valkyrie delegation had sent new representatives from their homeworld, beings with hard eyes and anger written into every line of their bodies, and they demanded answers that no one seemed able to provide. High Arbiter Draxon and his entire security team were murdered. The new Valkyrie ambassador announced to the assembled species, "This was clearly an act of war, and we demand that the humans responsible be surrendered for punishment." Commander Una Park stood in her usual position behind the human ambassador, her hands clasped and her face showing nothing but polite attention. Her arm was bandaged beneath her uniform sleeve, and her ribs ached with every breath. But no one looking at her would see anything unusual. She was simply a diplomatic attaché doing her job. The human ambassador rose to respond, his voice calm and measured. "The Valkyrie accusation is serious but unsupported by evidence," he said. "The station security investigation found no proof of human involvement, and the official report concludes that the incident was likely an internal conflict among Draxon's guards." "That is a lie," the Valkyrie ambassador snarled. "Draxon's guards would never turn on each other. This was an attack by an outside force, and only humans had reason to reason." The human ambassador interrupted gently. "What reason would humans have to attack a Valkyrie delegation? We have no territorial disputes with your people, no trade conflicts, no history of violence between our species." The Valkyrie ambassador opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. He could not mention Sophie without admitting that Draxon had been keeping a slave, and slavery was something that most species in the tribunal openly condemned. Could not explain the motive without revealing the crime. "We will conduct our own investigation," the Valkyrie ambassador finally said. "And when we find proof of human involvement, you will share it with the tribunal." The human ambassador agreed smoothly. "And appropriate action will be taken. Until then, perhaps we should focus on the business at hand rather than unproven accusations." The tribunal continued with its scheduled discussions. But Una noticed that something had changed. The other species were looking at the human delegation differently. Some of them glanced at Una herself, their eyes lingering on her bandaged arm and the careful way she held her body. They knew there was no proof, nothing that could be presented before an official hearing. But they knew Una met their gazes one by one and let them see nothing but a calm diplomatic attaché who had no idea what they were thinking about. After the session ended, Una was walking through the corridor toward her quarters when a voice stopped her. "Commander Park." She turned to find the Helix ambassador approaching, his countless small parts shifting and rippling in patterns that she had learned to read as curiosity. "Ambassador Velthan," she said with a polite bow. "How may I assist you?" The Helix ambassador studied her for a long moment, his eyes seeing heat patterns and muscle tension and all the things that bodies revealed without meaning to. "I have watched humanity for 50 years, he said finally. "Since your species first achieved faster than light travel and joined the galactic community, I have observed your diplomats and your traders and your explorers. And what have you concluded?" "I thought I understood you," Velthan said. "I thought humans were a young species still learning their place in the universe, eager to please and desperate to be accepted. I thought your politeness was submission and your diplomacy was weakness." Una said nothing. "I was wrong," Velthan continued. "You do not submit. You choose when to fight and when to wait. Your diplomacy is not weakness, but discipline. And your politeness is not submission, but restraint." He moved closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "I know what happened in the Valkyrie quarters. Commander, my species can read the truth in your body, even when your words say something else. And I know that you walked alone into a room with 13 killers and walked out the only one still breathing." "Ambassador," Una said carefully, "I do not know what you are suggesting." "I'm suggesting nothing," Beltham replied. I am simply telling you that the Helix Confederation has decided to strengthen our diplomatic ties with Earth. And several other species have made similar decisions in the past 3 days. Una felt something shift in her understanding. Why? Because we finally understand what humanity truly is, Beltham said. You are not weak, you are not soft, you are simply patient. And now we have seen what happens when a human's patience runs out. He began to walk away, then paused and looked back. The galaxy has many powerful species, he said, but none of them scare me the way humans do, because when I look at the others, I see what they are capable of, but when I look at humans, I see what they choose not to do. He left Una standing alone in the corridor with those words echoing in her mind. That night, after the station had grown quiet and the diplomats had retreated to their quarters, Una returned to the observation deck where she had stood on the first day of the tribunal. The dead star hung in the void outside, a dark sphere surrounded by the cold light of distant galaxies. She thought about Sophie, who was now safely aboard a transport heading for the Keth homeworld. She thought about Draxon and his guards, whose bodies had been returned to Valkyrie space for burial. She thought about the 12 species who had watched a young girl suffer and done nothing. And she thought about what it meant that none of them had tried to stop her in the lower levels of the station. The workers were telling a new story. Una had heard it whispered in the corridors, passed from mouth to mouth by beings who had spent their lives being overlooked and ignored. They spoke of a woman in black who had walked into darkness to save someone who could not save herself. They did not know her name. They did not need to know. Some stories were more powerful without names, more lasting without faces. The door behind Una opened, and she turned to find Torvin standing there with his countless parts rippling in what she now recognized as concern. You should not be walking around, he said. Your ribs are still healing. I needed to think. Torvin moved to stand beside her at the window. Two beings from opposite ends of the galaxy, watching the empty darkness together. The girl reached her transport safely, he said. She asked me to give you a message. What message? She said she will live a good life, Torvin replied. She said she will be kind to others who are afraid and alone. And she will never forget what you taught her. I did not teach her anything. You taught her that she matters, Torvin said. You taught her that even in a galaxy that had decided to look away, one person thought she was worth saving. That is not nothing. Commander, Una looked at the dead star and thought about all the lives that had once orbited it. All the beings who had loved and fought and dreamed beneath its light before it burned out. I broke every rule I swore to follow, she said quietly. I killed 13 beings and lied to my government and risked a war between species. And I would do it all again without hesitation. I know, Torvin said. That is what makes your species so terrifying. Una turned to look at him. We are terrifying because we would save one child. You are terrifying because you would sacrifice everything to save one child, Torvin said. Because your compassion has no limits and no conditions and no calculations of cost and benefit. Because when a human decides that something is worth protecting, the universe itself cannot stand in your way. He paused, and something in his posture shifted. The other species look at humans and see weakness because you choose kindness. But I've seen what happens when your kindness is not enough. And I have learned that human kindness is not the absence of strength. What is it then? It is the leash you put on your strength, Torvin said. And that night in the Valkyrie quarters, you let the leash slip. Una looked back at the stars and felt something inside her settle into place. Something that had been restless since she first saw Sophie, kneeling on the floor with tears on her face. She had broken her oath and stained her hands with blood and become something she had spent 20 years trying to leave behind, and she had saved one frightened girl from a monster that the entire galaxy had been too afraid to stop. "Thank you," she said to Torvin, "for helping me, and for keeping my secret." "I did not do it for you," Torvin replied. "I did it because sometimes the universe needs someone who will do what others cannot. And I wanted to see what that looked like." He turned and walked away. Leaving Yuna alone with the stars, she stood there for a long time, watching the darkness and thinking about all the things that humans were capable of when they stopped pretending to be civilized. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out her diplomatic insignia. She looked at it for a moment. This small piece of metal that represented everything she had chosen to become after leaving her old life. Behind then, she pinned it back on her collar and walked back to her quarters to prepare for another day of smiling and bowing and speaking in quiet tones, because that was what humanity was. In the end, not the violence or the kindness, but the choice between them and the knowledge that sometimes, when all other choices had failed, the violence was the kindest thing left to give. Draxon had lived for 200 years, and in all that time, he had never known fear. He had conquered enemies and crushed rebellions and built an empire of terror that stretched across a dozen worlds. And he had done it all because he understood one simple truth. Most beings valued their own survival above everything else. This human woman did know, saw it in the way she moved toward him despite her wounds, in the way her eyes never looked at anything except him, in the way her broken body continued forward when any sensible creature would have collapsed and begged for mercy. She was going to die. They both knew it, and she did not. Kara Draxon felt something cold crawl up his spine, something he had not experienced since he was a child facing his father's wrath for the first time. He squeezed Sovi's throat tighter, lifting the small Keth girl higher as a shield between himself and the approaching human. "Stop," he commanded. "One more step and I will crush her throat like paper." The human stopped, but she did not retreat. "You think I will not do it?" Draxon said, his voice rising with an edge that he did not like hearing. "You think I'm bluffing, but I have killed hundreds of beings with my bare hands. And this one means nothing to me." "She means something to me," the human said. And her voice was steady and quiet and terrifying in its certainty. "Then back away and let me leave, and I will release her when I reach my ship." The human tilted her head like she was considering the offer. And for a moment, Draxon allowed himself to believe that she would accept. "No," she said. "Then she dies." "Maybe," the human agreed. "But you die first." Shimava Draxon had seen Phos beings before. Species that could cross a room in the time it took to blink. Species that moved like light itself. This human was not that fast, but she was fast enough. Her hand struck the inside of his elbow, hitting a pressure point that sent lightning bolts of pain shooting up his arm. And his fingers opened reflexively. Before he could stop them, Sovi fell to the floor, gasping for breath. And Draxon stumbled backward with his arm hanging numb and useless. He swung at the human with his other hand, a blow that could shatter bones and crush organs. But she was not there. She was behind him now, and her knee drove into the back of his leg with enough force to buckle it. Draxon fell to one knee, and for the first time in 200 years, he looked up at someone standing over him. "You cannot do this," he said. And he hated how his voice trembled. "I am High Arbiter of the Valkyrie Dominion. My death will bring war to your species. Your worlds will burn and your people will be enslaved." And her hand closed around his throat. "Sovi," she said, without looking away from Draxon's face. "Close your eyes." The Keth girl on the floor pressed her hands over her face and curled into a ball. "Wait," Draxon gasped. "We can negotiate. I have wealth beyond measure. I have information that your government would pay anything to possess. I can give you. There is nothing you can give me," the human said. "That would make me forget what you did to her." Her grip tightened. Draxon had always believed that his final moments would be dignified, that he would face death with the pride and strength that had defined his entire life. Instead, he clawed at her hand with his remaining strength, and he begged, and he screamed, and then he did not do anything at all. Yuna released the body and let it fall to the floor, then turned to where Sophie lay trembling. "It is over," she said softly. "You are safe now." Sophie looked up with eyes that held too many emotions to count: fear and relief and confusion and something that might have been the beginning of hope. "You killed him," she whispered. "Yes, you killed all of them. For me." Yuna knelt beside the girl and gently touched her shoulder. "I killed them because they hurt you," she said, "and because no one else would stop them. And because some things are wrong, even when the law says they are permitted." Sophie stared at her with those huge cat eyes. And then she did something that Yuna did not expect. She laughed. It was a broken sound, half sob and half joy. The sound of someone who had spent so long in darkness that they had forgotten what light looked like. "The other species," Sophie said between gasps. "They told me that humans were weak. They said your kind hid behind words and treaties because you were too fragile to fight." "We are fragile," Yuna said. "That is why we learned to fight so well." She helped Sophie to her feet, then staggered as her injured body reminded her that willpower could only carry her so far. The Keth girl moved quickly to support her, small arms wrapping around Yuna's waist to keep her from falling. "You need medical attention," Sophie said, her voice shifting from victim to caretaker with a speed that spoke to the strength she had hidden inside herself all along. "I know someone who can help." They made their way through the Velthary quarters, stepping over bodies that Sophie tried not to look at, until they reached the maintenance shaft that Yuna had used to enter. The journey through the lower levels was slow and painful, but Torvin was waiting for them when they emerged. The Helix engineer looked at Yuna's wounds and at the blood covering her clothes and at the small Keth girl supporting her weight. And he did not ask any questions. "My medical training is basic," he said, as he led them to a small room filled with repair equipment and emergency supplies. "But I can stabilize you until a proper doctor becomes available." Yuna sat on a metal table and let Torvin work on her wounds, his countless small parts moving with surprising gentleness as he cleaned and sealed the worst of the coup. Sophie sat in a corner, watching with wide eyes, her hand unconsciously touching the marks on her throat where Draxon's fingers had been. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now you disappear," Yuna said through gritted teeth as Torvin did something painful to her ribs. "The Keth homeworld has already agreed to grant you asylum. There is a transport leaving tomorrow that will take you there." "How do you know this?" "I made arrangements before tonight." Sophie was quiet for a long moment. "You planned everything," she said finally. "You knew you might not survive. And you planned for what would happen to me anyway." Yuna met her eyes. "You matter, Sophie. Your life has value. And you deserve to be somewhere safe where no one will ever hurt you again." Tears began to fall down the Keth girl's face. But this time, they were not tears of fear. "What is your name?" Sophie asked. "Please. I need to know the name of the person who saved me." Yuna opened her mouth to answer, but Torvin spoke first. "She has no name," he said firmly. "She was never here. This conversation never happened. And when the station security asks questions tomorrow, neither of us will remember seeing any human in the lower levels tonight." Sophie looked confused, but then understanding dawned in her eyes. "If they find out it was you, then everything I did tonight will be used as proof that humans are dangerous and uncivilized," Yuna said. "And my people will pay the price for my choices." She reached out and took Sophie's small hand in hers. "You cannot tell anyone my name. And if anyone asks who saved you, you will say you do not know. You will say you escaped during a fight between Velthary guards. And you will never speak of tonight again." Sylvie looked at the human woman who had killed 13 beings to save her life, who had broken every rule and risked everything for a stranger. "I will remember you," Sylvie said. "Even if I cannot say your name, I will remember you forever." Una smiled. And for the first time since the night began, the expression reached her eyes. "That is enough." Torvin finished his work and stepped back. "You should rest," he said to Una. "Your body needs time to heal." But Una was already standing, already pulling on a clean shirt to hide her bandages, already becoming the unremarkable diplomatic attach that the station had always known. "I will rest when the tribunal is over," she said. "Until then, I have a role to play." She looked at Sylvie one last time, memorizing the face of the girl she had saved. Then, she walked out of the room and disappeared into the shadows of the lower levels, leaving behind nothing but bloodstains that Torvin would clean before morning. The maintenance shaft was narrow and dark and smelled like rust, and Una moved through it without making a sound. She wore simple black clothes with no markings and no identification, and her hair was pulled back tight against her skull so nothing could be grabbed in a fight. She carried no weapons. She did not need them. The clock in her mind told her it was 0300 station time, 1 hour after the guard rotation, which meant the Valkyrie security team would be settled into their positions and confident that the night would pass without incident. Una emerged from the shaft into a corridor lined with expensive materials and soft lighting, the kind of luxury that powerful beings surrounded themselves with to remind everyone else of their importance. 2 guards stood at the far end of the corridor, their massive bodies blocking the path to the Valkyrie quarters. They did not see her. First guard was looking at a datapad when Una's hand struck the nerve cluster at the base of his skull, and he crumpled to the floor without understanding what had happened. The second guard turned at the sound, his eyes going wide as he saw a small human woman standing over his fallen companion. And then Una was moving. She drove her knee into the soft tissue beneath his armor and followed with an elbow to his throat, and he fell beside his partner with a sound like air escaping from a broken seal. 2 down, 10 to go. The corridor ahead split into 3 directions, and Una chose the left path based on the map she had built in her mind over the past 2 days. She found the third guard standing alone outside a storage room, his attention focused on the door he was supposed to protect rather than the shadows behind him. He was dead before he hit the ground. Una moved faster now, knowing that time was running out, knowing that every second brought her closer to discovery. The 4th and 5th guards were talking to each other when she found them, their voices low and casual as they discussed something that did not matter. She hit the first one in the throat and used his falling body as a shield against the second, then drove her fingers into the soft spot beneath the second guard's jaw. They fell together in a tangle of limbs and armor, and Una was already moving before they stopped breathing. The alarm sounded when she killed the 6th guard. A high wailing sound filled the corridor, and lights began flashing red along the walls, and Una heard the heavy footsteps of the remaining guards running toward her position. She had hoped to reach Draxon before this happened, but hope was a luxury she could not afford. The remaining 6 guards formed a line at the end of the corridor, their bodies creating a wall of muscle and armor between Una and the door to Draxon's chamber. They were professionals who had faced death many times, and they moved with the confidence of beings who had never lost a fight. The lead guard raised a weapon and fired. Una was not where the blast landed. She had moved the instant she saw his arm begin to rise, her body shifting 3 steps to the left while his weapon was still pointing at empty air, and she was among them. The fight was nothing like the stories that warriors told around fires, nothing like the graceful dances that entertainers performed for crowds. It was brutal and ugly and fast. Una drove her fist into the first guard's eye socket and felt something crack beneath her knuckles, then used his body as leverage to launch herself at the second guard before he could bring his weapon. A roundy blade caught her arm as she moved, cutting deep into the muscle, and she felt hot blood begin to run down her skin. She ignored it. The second guard fell with her fingers wrapped around his throat, and the third guard's weapon discharge missed her head by less than a hand's width. She broke his knee with a kick that used every ounce of strength in her body, then finished him with a strike to the temple. As he fell, 3 guards remained standing. They spread out to surround her, and Yuna saw the calculation in their eyes, the cold assessment of a predator measuring prey. She smiled. It was not a nice smile. The 4th guard rushed her, while the 5th and 6th moved to flank. And Yuna let him come, let him think he had her trapped, let him commit to an attack that left his center exposed. She stepped inside his reach and drove her palm into his chest with a force that stopped his heart. The 5th guard's blade caught her across the ribs as she turned, and she felt bones crack beneath the impact, felt pain explode through her body like fire through dry wood. She grabbed his arm before he could pull the blade back and twisted until she heard the joint come apart, then used his screaming body as a shield against the 6th guard's attack. The 6th guard hesitated for half a second, unwilling to hurt his companion, and that hesitation was the last mistake he ever made. Yuna released the 5th guard and moved through the yad, opening like water through a crack in stone. Her hands found the 6th guard's throat and did not let go until he stopped moving. The 5th guard was trying to crawl away with his ruined arm hanging useless at his side, and Yuna watched him for a moment, her chest heaving and her body screaming with pain from a dozen wounds. "Please," he said in Gulthari, a word she understood even without translation. She thought about mercy. She thought about Sovi kneeling on the floor with tears running down her face while this guard stood watching and did nothing. She did not feel merciful when the corridor was silent again. Yuna stood alone among 12 bodies, her black clothes soaked with blood that was mostly not her own. Her left arm hung awkward and wrong where the blade had cut too deep, and every breath sent sharp pain through her cracked ribs, and she could feel her strength beginning to fade. But the door to Draxon's chamber was in front of her, and she had not come this far to stop now. She reached for the access panel and entered the code that Torvin had given her, and the door slid open with a soft sound. The room beyond was dark, except for a single light in the center, and in that light stood High Arbiter Draxon with his massive hand wrapped around Sovi's throat. The girl's feet dangled above the floor, and her eyes were wide with terror, and she made small choking sounds as she tried to breathe. "Human," Draxon said, and his voice was calm and curious, like a scientist examining an interesting specimen. "I wondered when one of your kind would finally show their true nature." Yuna stepped into the room, her body broken and bleeding, her face showing nothing but cold determination. "Let her go," Draxon laughed, and the sound was like stones grinding against each other. "If I release her, you will kill me, and if I keep her, you cannot attack without risking her life. So we are at an impasse." He tightened his grip, and Sovi made a sound that would haunt Yuna's dreams for the rest of her life. "Your species talks endlessly about morality and compassion," Draxon continued, "but look at what you have done tonight. You have murdered 12 of my guards in cold blood. And for what? For a girl who is not even your own kind." Yuna took another step forward. "I said let her go." "Or what?" Draxon asked. "What will you do, little human, that you have not already done?" Yuna looked at Sovi's terrified face and made a decision that would change everything. "I will show you," she said, "what humans become when we stop pretending to be civilized." And then she moved. The Concord station hung in the void like a metal flower, spinning slowly around a star that had died 10,000 years ago. And Commander Yuna Park stood at the observation deck, watching ships arrive from every corner of the galaxy. She had been stationed here for 3 years now, serving as security attached for the human delegation. And in all that time, she had never raised her hand against another being. The other species thought humans were soft. They saw Una smile at diplomats and bow her head in respect and speak in quiet tones. And they believed this was weakness. They did not know what lived beneath the calm surface today. It was the opening day of the annual Galactic Tribunal, and representatives from 12 species had gathered to discuss trade routes and territorial disputes, and all the small matters that kept the galaxy from falling into war. Una wore her formal uniform, the dark blue fabric pressed and perfect, the diplomatic insignia gleaming on her collar. She looked like a woman who had never known violence. This was exactly what she wanted them to believe. The Valkyrie delegation arrived at midday, their massive ships blocking out the light of distant stars as they docked at the station. The Valkyrie were an old species, proud and cruel in ways that other species had learned to ignore. They stood 3 meters tall, with skin like polished stone and eyes that reflected no light at all. Their leader was High Arbiter Draxon, a being who had ruled his people for 200 years through fear and absolute control. Una watched him walk through the arrival hall with his 12 elite guards surrounding him, each one a killer who had ended more than 100 lives in service to their master. She noted their positions and their weapons and the way they moved. Old habits never truly died. The opening ceremony took place in the Grand Chamber, a massive room with walls of transparent crystal that showed the endless darkness of space beyond. Representatives from all 12 species sat at a curved table, and Una stood behind the human ambassador with her hands clasped and her face showing nothing. She was listening to a speech about cooperation and mutual respect. When she saw the girl, the Keth were a small species, gentle beings with fur the color of autumn leaves and large eyes that showed every emotion they felt. They served as translators and record keepers throughout the galaxy because their minds could hold dozens of languages at once. Girl standing behind the Valkyrie delegation was young, barely an adult by Keth standards, and she wore a collar around her throat that marked her as property. Her name was Sophie, and she was terrified. Una saw it in the way the girl flinched whenever Draxon moved, in the way her hands trembled when she translated his words, in the way her eyes dropped to the floor whenever he looked in her direction. The other species saw this too. None of them spoke after the ceremony. Una moved through the station like a shadow, asking quiet questions and listening to the answers that came in whispers. She learned that Draxon had claimed Sophie under an ancient Valkyrie custom that allowed high-ranking officials to take servants from lesser species. The custom was barbaric and cruel, but it was illegal under Valkyrie law, and diplomatic immunity meant that no one could interfere. Sophie was not the first. There had been others before her, young beings from vulnerable species who had caught Draxon's attention. None of them had survived more than a year in his service. The workers in the lower levels spoke of screams that echoed through the walls at night, of bruises hidden beneath clothing, of a girl who had once laughed and smiled and now moved like a ghost through the corridors. Una listened to every word. That night, she found Sophie alone in a storage bay, curled into a corner with her arms wrapped around her knees. The girl looked up when Una entered, and her eyes went wide with fear before she recognized the human uniform. "I am sorry," Sophie whispered in broken common tongue. "I should not be here. I will return to my quarters immediately." Una crouched down until she was at eye level with the girl. "You do not need to apologize," she said softly. "I am not here to report you." Sophie stared at her with those huge, frightened eyes, and Una saw the marks on her arms where the fur had been rubbed away by rough handling. "Why do you hide here?" Una asked. "It is quiet," Sophie said. "He does not look for me in quiet places. He prefers rooms where others can see." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that needed no explanation. Una wanted to tell the girl that everything would be fine, that someone would help her, that the galaxy was not as cruel as it seemed, but she could not lie. "What is your name?" she asked instead. "Sovi," the girl said, though he does not use it. "He calls me other things." Yuna reached out slowly, giving Sovi time to pull away, and gently touched the girl's hand. "I will remember your name." "Sovi." The Keth girl looked at her with something that might have been hope, or might have been the last ember of a fire that had nearly gone out. "You are human," Sovi said. "I have heard stories about your kind. They say you are dangerous. Do I seem dangerous to you?" Sovi studied her for a long moment, her large eyes searching Yuna's face for something she could not name. "No," she said finally. "You seem sad." Yuna smiled, and the expression did not reach her eyes. "Perhaps I am." She stood and walked to the door, then paused and looked back at the girl still curled in the corner. "Stay hidden as long as you can. Sovi, the tribunal will last 7 days, and then his ship will leave, and I will leave with it," Sovi said, her voice flat with acceptance. Yuna did not answer. She walked back to her quarters through corridors filled with diplomats and delegates who smiled and nodded as she passed. They saw a human woman in a clean uniform, with a calm face and gentle manner. They did not see the calculations running through her mind, the maps being drawn, the plans taking shape in the darkness behind her eyes in her quarters. Yuna stood before the mirror and looked at the woman staring back at her 20 years ago. She had been something else. 20 years ago, she had moved through shadows and ended lives, and asked no questions about whether her targets deserved their fate. She had killed for her government, for her species, for reasons that seemed important. At the time when she had stopped, she had put away her weapons and learned to smile and speak softly and pretend that the violence inside her had died, but it had not died. It had only been sleeping. Yuna opened a drawer and looked at the diplomatic insignia that represented everything she had become, everything she had chosen to be. She thought about Sovi, curled in that storage bay with fear in her eyes and marks on her arms. She thought about the 11 other species who saw the same thing and chose to look away. She thought about what it meant to be human. Slowly, carefully, she removed the insignia from her collar and placed it in the drawer. Then she closed the drawer and began to stretch her body in ways she had not done for 20 years. Feeling old muscles remember movements they had never truly forgotten. Tomorrow, she would smile and bow and speak in quiet tones. But tonight, she would prepare, because some things mattered more than diplomacy, and some people deserved to be saved. And some humans had not forgotten what they truly were beneath the gentle surface they showed the world. The lower levels of Concord Station smelled like machine oil and recycled air, and the beings who lived there had learned long ago that no one from above cared about their existence. Yuna moved through these corridors like she belonged, her uniform replaced by simple gray clothes that workers wore, her face unremarkable and forgettable. She had always been good at becoming invisible. The maintenance tunnels ran through the entire station like veins through a body, and Yuna spent the first night memorizing every path and every junction and every access point that might be useful. She counted steps and noted doorways, and built a map inside her mind that no one else would ever see. On the second day of the tribunal, she found Tovanth Helix with strange beings, their bodies made of countless small organisms that moved together as one, and their eyes could see things that other species could not. Irvan worked as an engineer in the lower levels, repairing systems that the station needed to survive, and he watched Yuna approach with an expression that suggested he already knew why she had come. "Your body temperature is elevated," he said in a voice that sounded like wind through dry leaves. "Your heart rate is controlled, but faster than baseline, and the pattern of heat in your muscles suggests you have been preparing them for sustained physical activity." Yuna did not deny it. "You read intention," she said. "I read biology," Torvin replied. Intention is simply biology with purpose. And your purpose is clear to anyone who knows how to look. They stood in a corridor that hummed with the sound of distant machinery. Two beings from opposite ends of the galaxy, having a conversation that neither would ever acknowledge happened. The Valkyrie guards. Una said, "Tell me about them." Torvin's countless small parts shifted and rippled. A gesture that might have been discomfort or might have been something else entirely. "There are 12, he said. "Each one has served Draxon for at least 50 years. And each one has killed more than 100 beings in combat. They are trained in 17 forms of armed fighting and 12 forms of unkilling. Their armor can stop most energy weapons. And their reaction time is faster than any species, except perhaps the Keth. Weaknesses. They are confident," Torvin said. "They have never faced a serious threat because no one has been foolish enough to challenge them. And confidence makes beings predictable." Una filed this information away in the part of her mind that had never stopped being a weapon. "The girl," she said. "Sophie, where is she kept at night?" Torvin went still, his countless parts freezing in place like a photograph of a waterfall. "My species values neutrality," he said slowly. "We do not take sides, we do not interfere. We observe and record and let the universe unfold as it will." "I'm not asking your species," Una said. "I am asking you." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of a decision that could not be undone. "I have seen what Draxon does," Torvin finally said. "I have heard the sounds that come from his quarters at night. And I have treated the injuries of workers who accidentally witness things they should not have seen." He paused, and something in his posture changed, becoming harder and more certain. "The girl is kept in a small room adjacent to Draxon's personal chamber. Access code 7-7-9-Alpha-3. The guards rotate every 4 hours with the shift change at 0200 station time. And there is a maintenance shaft behind the waste processing unit that connects to the corridor outside the Valkyrie quarters." Una nodded once. "I did not tell you this," Torvin said. "You did not tell me anything." Una agreed. "We never met. And this conversation never happened." She turned to leave. But Torvin's voice stopped her. "Human," he said. And she looked back at him. "I have studied your species for 30 years. And I still do not understand you. Your bodies are fragile, and your lifespans are short. And you have only been traveling between stars for 200 years. Is there a question in that observation?" "The question is simple," Torvin said. "Why do you care what happens to one Keth girl who is not part of your species and not part of your delegation and whose survival offers you no benefit whatsoever?" Una considered the question for a long moment. "Because she is afraid," she said finally. "And because I can help, and because choosing not to help when I could would make me something I do not want to be." Torvin stared at her with eyes that saw heat and intention and all the things that bodies revealed without meaning to. "You are going to die," he said. "The probability of success against 12 elite Valkyrie guards is less than 3%. Then I will die trying." She walked away before he could respond, disappearing into the shadows of the lower levels, like she had never been there at all that evening. The Valkyrie delegation hosted a formal dinner for all the tribunal representatives. And Una stood in her usual position behind the human ambassador with her hands clasped and her face showing nothing. Draxon sat at the head of the table like a king holding court. And Sophie stood behind him translating his words into common tongue for those who did not speak. Valthorith, High Arbiter, was discussing trade agreements when he decided to make a point about human weakness. He called Sophie forward and commanded her to kneel beside his chair, then placed his massive hand on her head like she was a pet rather than a person. "This is how lesser beings should be treated," he announced to the room. "The humans speak of equality and respect, but these are the words of a species too weak to take what they want, The other delegation shifted uncomfortably in their seats but said nothing. Draxon looked directly at the human ambassador and smiled with teeth like broken glass. "Perhaps we should claim one of your females as well," he said. "They seem soft and fragile, and softness can be trained to serve." Una felt something cold and sharp wake up in her chest, something she had spent 20 years trying to bury. She did not move. She did not speak, but she memorized the exact angle of Draxon's throat and calculated the precise amount of force it would take to crush his windpipe. The human ambassador responded with diplomatic words about mutual respect and the importance of cooperation, and the moment passed like a cloud moving across the sun. But Una had seen the tears running down Sylvie's face as she knelt on the floor, and she had seen the other species look away rather than witness the humiliation of a child. That night, Una returned to her quarters and locked the door and stood in the center of the room, breathing slowly and deeply. She thought about the oath she had taken when she left her old life behind, the promise that she would never again use her skills to hurt another living being. She thought about Sylvie's tears and Draxon's smile and a silence of a galaxy that had decided some lives simply did not matter. Then she began to move. Her body flowed through patterns she had learned decades ago, strikes and blocks and holds that had been designed to kill quickly and efficiently. She practiced until her muscles burned and her breath came hard, until her body remembered everything her mind had tried to forget. Tomorrow, the tribunal would continue, and she would smile and bow and speak in quiet tones. But the night after that, everything would change. Una looked at her hands in the dim light of her quarters and saw them clearly for the first time in 20 years. They were the hands of a killer, and sometimes killing was the only kindness left to give.